Well, hello, everyone. Tuned into FreightWaves Global Supply Chain Week, and welcome to our fireside chat on how Joe Biden's infrastructure plan could bring a once-in-a-generation boost to last-mile delivery. I'm John Gallagher, Senior Editor at FreightWaves, and I'm happy to welcome with us today David Braunstein. He's the president of a nonprofit organization called Together for Safer Roads, or TSR. Through this organization, David has an interesting perspective in the context of the next infrastructure bill on how road safety, particularly in the last mile sector, can be a catalyst for making last mile freight delivery more efficient. So welcome, David, to Global Supply Chain Week, and thanks for taking the time to be with us today.
Yeah, hey, thanks, John. Thanks for inviting us to be here. It's our pleasure to join you this week.
Nice. So David, could you start by briefly just explaining how Together for Safer Roads started and the organization's primary goals?
Yeah, so Together for Safer Roads is a nonprofit, as you said, but it's founded and funded by the private sector. So it was founded back in late 2014 by some companies that wanted to get more involved in global road safety initiatives. So those companies were Anheuser-Busch InBev and AIG and Republic Services and several others. And they essentially realized that as the roads became a public health issue, that there really needed to be more partnership between the private sector and the public sector. So that was the reason for founding TSR, and we've been working ever since to bring private sector technology and data and expertise that can prevent crashes, injuries, and fatalities to this global road safety work that's happening around the world.
Gotcha. You made a prediction recently that 2021 will be a year where it's something that you referred to as roadway digitization. That receives more spotlight and funding, especially with the renewed federal focus on infrastructure that President Biden has talked about so far. So first, could you just explain what roadway digitization means, and then why you think it will be getting a bigger spotlight this year?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, and I gather it might be a mouthful for some people.
For me, anyway.
Yeah, eventually we can come up with a better term for it. But essentially it means helping road users to understand the infrastructure that we use through digital, insight, right? So if you think about the roads right now, certainly everything that exists physically could exist digitally. Whether that's signage or road usage data or other things. And the process of making that information available digitally, as has been happening in so many other parts of our community and society, is something that we refer to as roadway digitization. So taking things that are currently typically analog or physically based, turning that into digital insight that can be used by road users, especially commercial road users who obviously put a lot of vehicle miles traveled on their vehicles and across their fleets and their supply chains. It's critical that insight about roadways and especially the safety aspects of roadways becomes more usable. And that's what the promise of digitization is to create more utility from the insight about those roadways.
So, David, truck safety groups are always calling out, and rightly so, the concerning statistics around trucking accidents and injuries and fatalities. I understand that your organization has been getting a handle around a particular statistic called near misses. Could you explain how you're collecting that data and talk about how this informs how roads are being designed?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question. So near miss, I think just commonly said, it's just any incident where two road users nearly collided, right? We care about this obviously because, a lot of times, there are individual road users, some in large vehicles and some, who are not in vehicles at all. right? And I think it's just helpful for us as a society and as road users and road authorities to really have a handle on how often that happens, because those are the incidents that go unreported. So TSR had an opportunity going back a couple of years to engage with a startup that was able to take video footage from intersections and calculate near misses. So as opposed to a near miss being a self-reported incident from a road user, whether that's a truck driver or somebody in a car or somebody walking or biking, this actually used video footage to calculate when there was a near incident and how severe that incident may have been if it's something had happened, and then it quantifies it. So it's a huge step change for everybody that's involved in using our roads, because now you can understand things before they happen, because we've been able to prove using this technology that these kinds of incidents are actually proxies for other kinds of incidents that actually, have more dire consequences, like crashes, injuries, and fatalities. So from a commercial road user standpoint, I think we all have a stake in having these better metrics be available to road designers, because quite frankly, they don't always know where the next incident's going to occur. And so we're kind of chasing the next incident. And to the extent that we can become more predictive, in understanding where the next incident's going to happen, everything gets safer for all road users. So, especially with, last mile delivery becoming so much more prominent in, our urban centers, we all know how challenging it can be to navigate those roads. Having better data and insight into near misses has the potential to really help the authorities to design roads so that you can separate traffic, so that you can direct traffic differently. You can, you can just create better facilities for all road users that keeps everybody safe in sharing the roads.
Right, right. And our global supply chain conference today, we're focusing on food and perishables, which includes the last mile delivery to restaurants. Over the past year, the supply chain that feeds the restaurant sector has been hit hard by the pandemic, with a lot of these local restaurants forced to ratchet down the amount of supplies that they're receiving due to caps on seating capacity, for example. So I understand TSR partners with carriers in this sector. So are there any changes you see with regard to safety risks over the past year regarding the food perishable delivery, or any learning opportunities here?
Yeah, so the first thing I would say is, and this isn't necessarily specific to food and perishables, but a general statement is that I think not everybody realizes that despite the fact that traffic volumes were down, traffic risk of crashes actually went up. And I think that's something just to acknowledge, that there was a 15 to 20% increase in crash risk, despite the fact that volumes were down, right? So that affects everybody. As far as food and perishables goes, I think as volumes are coming back up and people are going to be starting to hit the streets more, I think that we have learned some things. I was talking with one of our members in public services recently. They've actually been able to transition to a digital training methodology since the pandemic hit, that they find to be as effective and more scalable than what they were doing previously. So I think, they're on the back end of food and perishables, right? So, these are obviously public services picking up waste from commercial facilities and residential facilities. And they are finding that they can actually train their staff better digitally, certainly better than they ever thought. And it's more scalable than it was before. So that's one sort of counterintuitive finding coming from one of our members. The other parts are sort of probably more germane to COVID specifically, like these, food and perishables industry has seen on the one hand, a decline in the on-premise side of things, restaurants and whatnot, but grocery chains have seen tremendous increases in activity in their supply chains. And I think that when you look at, being able to deliver goods safely to grocery chains, I think that's an important aspect of this, because I think that the digital side of grocery delivery actually has been growing, and it grew dramatically as a result of COVID. And I think that's here to stay. So from that standpoint, consumers are going to be picking up, especially in suburban areas, going to be picking up more groceries and having them delivered to their homes. That side of the digital supply chain, I think, is needs to be looked at, and I know that our members are looking at it, and they are in fact making some changes to make the end-to-end experience safer. And part of that is also instituting new safety technologies on vehicles that I think is not a trivial thing when you look at it across the supply chain. That they're making their vehicles safer by using all sorts of new technologies on those vehicles that have actually proven to make them safer during these difficult times.
Right. Yeah. Joe Biden said he plans to work with Congress to increase federal funding to a program called the Highway Safety Improvement Program, which I think you're familiar with. It's a federal program administered by the Federal Highway Administration, and it's aimed at reducing traffic fatalities and injuries on all public roads with a focus on leveraging data. So what does boosting funding for this program mean for the last mile freight segment?
Yeah, well, look, again, I think I've said this a couple times. We're all road users, the freight and goods side of things, as well as others that are sharing the roads with commercial road users. And to the extent that the Highway Safety Improvement Program has been underfunded, let's say for many across many administrations, it's really important that those funds flow into safety-specific improvements. Right? When you look at the Biden plan, if you call it an infrastructure program, that's great. That's fine. We need to have our infrastructure upgraded for all sorts of reasons, including the efficient movement of goods. But also just in terms of embedding safety in those improvements. So as you're improving a road segment, you should be upgrading it from a safety perspective. It improves things for all road users. I'll give you an example. That the cycling is taking off across the world, right? And commercial road users are encountering cyclists more and more often because of that. And having more dedicated cycling infrastructure is an important thing. And those highway safety improvement programs are going to emphasize those kinds of improvements. Separating cycling traffic from other road users is important. And it doesn't have to negatively impact efficiency either. So carefully planned and well-funded safety improvement programs are a benefit for everybody. Especially a last mile delivery, where a lot of cycling activity is happening now, let alone scooters and the like that are coming onto our roadways. Everybody needs to be safe. Nobody wants to have an incident with a vulnerable road user. Certainly not somebody that spends their whole day, their whole job is to deliver goods safely to their customers. I know that nobody in the freight industry wants to have an incident like that. So I think, more funding for this highway safety improvement programs is a good thing for everybody.
Yeah, and wanted to ask you also, last week, Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, said that infrastructure, this goes to how we're going to pay for this. So she said basically that probably paying for infrastructure would be through tax increases. So I wanted to get your opinion, David. How do you think this plan should be paid for? What is your take on that?
Yeah, that's a tricky question. I don't claim to be a public sector funding expert, but I could see how changes to taxes might be an element of that. I also think that, as we look at sustainability, certainly the Highway Trust Fund has to be looked at again. If that is based largely on taxes on fuel and the like, then as fuel sources change, we need to be looking at that. I also think that with someone like Pete Buttigieg leading the DOT, I think you might find some creative avenues that are proposed that relate to public-private partnerships, and how we understand who's using roads, who's using them safely, who's using them effectively, and have that be an element of the charging mechanisms for road usage. But I honestly couldn't tell you that I have a preference. I just know it needs to happen, and we need to keep an open mind as industry, as well as communities, to how we fund it, because we have a terrible amount of technical debt that we have to pay off in terms of the roads being underinvested in. So we should keep an open mind in terms of how we put this together, and have multiple stakeholders at the table as we're making those decisions.
Yeah, yeah. A few weeks ago, I wanted to ask you about this because I hadn't heard about it. But the Federal Highway Administration, they tacked on a 60-day extension period to a program, to something called for comments on something called the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices. So apparently this is the first major revision in like 10 years. So what role, if any, does this document play in advancing roadway digitization?
Yeah, look, it's mostly about, if you do a quick scan of the document, it's mostly about the ways that road users understand the roadways, and that includes signalization and lane markings and crosswalks and signage and things like that. But I think when you think about what's happening already in smart cities and roadway digitization, I think it will have an important impact. It's an important opportunity for everybody to rethink how people understand how to use the roads, right? And I think as authorities are now going to be forced to look at those things that signal safe usage of roads and efficient uses of roads, we're going to find new opportunities for the private sector and public sector to get together and communicate that information in new ways. I think a lot of the audience are already using a lot of technology in their supply chains, and to the extent that that same information about the uniform traffic control devices becomes digitized through this process, I think that's a good thing for everybody. Because if you're using a routing system, we know for a fact that a lot of the information that is already out there for the taking isn't in those routing systems, and it could be. And I think that this uniform traffic control devices update actually gives us another incentive to look at those things and bring that insight to the freight industry as well as other road users to just make it safer and more efficient for everybody.
Gotcha. And I'm just you mentioned the Secretary of Transportation in your last answer. You said, but based on what you've read or seen so far, David, with the approach that has been taken, that the approach that Buttigieg has been taking to infrastructure, what role do you see him playing with regard to President Biden's blueprint, so to speak?
Yeah, I think that they're fairly well aligned. Look, we'll see. We haven't actually seen the proposal yet at a granular level, but from what I gathered, Buttigieg's platform when he was running is very similar to what Biden has now proposed. So I think there's good alignment there from a policy standpoint. And look, I think while Buttigieg doesn't have as much transportation expertise as, let's say a lifelong transportation agency executive, he is a smart individual. I think he's pretty thoughtful, and they have started to hire some real pros who have been in the industry for a long time. So I think that combination, it bodes well, but the devil will be in the details, right? And, there are going to have to be compromises made. But I'm hopeful that we're going to get this infrastructure bill passed, and that it's going to benefit not only safety but also sustainability in other areas that are critical when it comes to managing our infrastructure.
Yeah, a couple of weeks ago, my editor was on FreightWaves TV, and we're doing a little update, and he asked me for my prediction about an infrastructure bill, and I said that, obviously it remains to be seen, but I predicted that I thought we'd finally gonna get a long-term surface bill passed this year, just based on Biden's stated intentions of willing to compromise with both sides of the aisle. And this is one of those. It's an issue that's as bipartisan as they come. So
it really is.
Yeah. So we'll have to see. Well, thank you, David. That was a really good discussion. For those of you who want to check out your organization, they can find it at togetherforsaferroads.org. So again, thank you very much, David, for joining us.
Thanks for having me, John. It was a pleasure.
And thanks to everyone for joining us today, and stay tuned for the next panel.